Hi class, we at Syndicate 1 will be introducing the concept of a psychological contract. The most widely accepted definition of a psychological contract is that the psychological contract is individual beliefs shaped by the organization regarding terms of an exchange agreement between the individual and their organization. It refers to the unwritten, intangible agreement between an employee and employer that describes the informal commitments, expectations, and understandings that comprise their relationship. It is often contrasted to the written employment contract, which is an explicit and legally binding agreement. Examples of psychological contracts are job security, opportunities for promotions, learning and development, maintaining the employer's reputation, perceived fairness of remuneration, flexibility, the expectation to go above and beyond, to work contracted hours. In this slide, we will take you through the key features of the psychological contract as well as types of contracts. The key features of psychological contracts are that they are based on beliefs or perceptions. Therefore, different individuals may have different perceptions of what is entailed in the psychological contract. The psychological contract is implicit rather than explicit and is usually constructed based on observed behaviors of the other party. It is based on a perceived agreement rather than an actual agreement, which could result in disagreements on the content of the psychological contract. It is based on the principle of reciprocity, where there is an expectation of receiving something in return for an implied promise to behave in a certain way. The psychological contract is ongoing and evolving, as constant interactions between the parties will imply certain mutual expectations, obligations, and promises. Hall identifies four variants of the psychological contract. The first one being transactional contracts, which are very specific, narrow, and are based on behaviors over a limited time period. These contracts tend to emphasize financial rewards in exchange for certain behaviors. An example of this is performance bonuses. The next variant is relational contracts, which are broad ranged and based on a longer term relationship. Examples of this are job security and well being. Balance contracts involve a mix of transactional and relational contracts. And lastly, transitional contracts, which arise in response to a crisis or short term contingency. In this slide, we will unpack some of the psychological contracts demonstrated in the video. In the interview, Brandon, the interviewee, inquired about flexible working hours and ways of working from home. This is something that will be influenced by experiences and observed behavior. There could be instances where Brandon is required to be available outside of working hours in special circumstances. There was an expectation created that employees should not be lounging at the pool during working hours and to be in an environment that is perceived to be more conducive to effective work. Brandon also inquired about the salary proposed. Alani mentioned that they can meet the market related salary and he created an expectation of excitement around the salary structure. Alani, however, based the salary on the firm's internal market and not the wider external market in the field. This was a psychological contract as Brandon had an expectation that he would be fairly remunerated for his duties. Different organizations have different ways of addressing their senior staff based on the culture and values of the organization, exhibited by past behavior. Brandon learned through experience here that Kalani's company is very formal in the way in which it addresses senior staff. This creates a psychological contract on how Brandon is to address his manager in the future. Kalani was vague in terms of the job description for the role. Some organizations confer duties onto staff, which evolves as the company changes, and this creates new expectations of staff, which is not documented under an employment contract. It is rather based on experience and expected behavior, which forms a psychological contract. This slide will enlighten us on how all of this affects our organizations and what we can take away from this concept. The first is that psychological contracts can improve employee satisfaction. It is noted in a paper by Yan and Monsor that the higher the consistency of the psychological contract between the two parties of employment, the greater the employee's satisfaction with the organization. A study by Shaw and Barksdale shows that a psychological contract can help the employment insecurity decline for both parties and can also be used to regulate an employee's behavior in the organization. In reality, the psychological contract has more to do with the day to day experience of work than the legal employment contract. How an employee acts, works, and behaves is shaped by their perceived fairness of the psychological contract with their employer. It is important for the parties to the psychological contract to have frequent discussions to clear any misconceptions regarding their expectations and obligations from these contracts and ensure that the psychological contracts are balanced and mutually beneficial. A 2002 UK survey found that 36% of HR managers use this concept to manage their employment relationship, and that 90% agreed that it was a useful concept. Thank you for joining our virtual class. We hope that this helped you understand the concept of a psychological contract.